What's up guys, this is Kim from EinfachMachen, and in this video I'd like to share with you a new ALM feature for the Power Platform, the Delegated Deployments using service principals. Enjoy! As always, first of all, let's start with our user story. As an admin, I want to let the users perform deployments without assigning too many rights to them to enable them to perform ALM, application lifecycle management, independently. And the solution for this is that Power Platform pipelines now support delegated deployments using service principals. What do we need for this? We have on the one hand the Power Platform pipelines solution, and on the second hand an app registration or a service principal. But what is the current challenge? Why do I think this is quite valuable from a security and admin perspective? Currently, if a developer wants to deploy something to a test or a prod environment, he needs the same permissions on the target environments as well as on the developer environments. Milad Trevandi, we've talked a lot recently, explained this great in a video. I will link the video in the video description. And with the service principle, we are now able to let the developers develop on their development environment and then use the service principle to deploy the solution to the target environment. So for example, to a test environment or to a prod environment without giving the developer or the maker comprehensive privileges and security roles on this environment. So one example for this would be that we have, for example, a solution which has one or multiple security roles for different Dataverse table. The security role was initially created from an admin, so the citizen developers can develop on the development environment. And every time the citizen developer wants to deploy the solution to a test or prod, the admin has to do this job, since only system admins can create security roles in the target environment. And if we take a look on the security role table in Dataverse, you can see that we've got here the basic user role, so he has almost no access to this table. And the more we go to the more privileged roles, we can see that even the system customizer has only read rights for the security roles table. And if we want to deploy a solution, we need to create a security role on the target environment. And as you can see, only the system administrator role has the privileges to create and delete security roles in a respective environment. So what are the steps toward creating this delegated deployment? I will walk you through these sub-steps in more detail. I would just explain the overall tasks you have to perform. First of all, we of course need the Power Platform pipelines to use these delegated permissions. Afterwards, or before, that depends on your preferences, you have to create a service principal. And the service principal of course needs access to all the environments where it should be used, so your dev, your test, and your prod environment. After that, I've created the pipelines. After creating pipelines, we need to authorize the user for the pipeline so that a developer can use this pipeline. And last but not least, the deployment is performed by the maker, and the expected outcome should be that the developer can perform the deployment even though he has only, for example, basic user rights on the specific target environment where the solution should be deployed to. So what we need for this demo are three environments. We start off with our dev environment, which is a type of sandbox and does not need to be a managed environment. We will also install the Power Platform pipelines in this environment. In the documentation, Microsoft recommend to define a separate host environment for the pipelines. Nevertheless, for the demo, we will use this dev environment. And we need a test and our prod environment. The test and the prod environments need to be managed environments because this is currently, Power Platform pipelines is currently only a feature of managed environments. You can select the specific environments and enable the managed environments features. You have a lot to configure here. We will leave this as it is and enable the managed environment features also for our prod environment. For the test environment, it is already enabled. So after we've enabled the managed environment feature, we will start with our dev environment because this is the place where we want to install the Power Platform pipelines. We go to the Dynamics 365 apps and click on Install Apps. And now we can look for the pipeline app. You have to scroll a bit, search again for it. There it is, Power Platform pipelines. Click on Next, agree to the terms and condition, and click on Install. And now the solution gets installed on your dev environment. This can take a while. It took about 10 minutes. in my case the last time I did it. And let's have a look on our dev environment now. There it is. We currently do not have the app that we need here, so we will wait some time, and we can already see that here's this new solution which got just installed. So after some minutes there are some other solutions which got installed, and if we click on apps now, we can see the deployment pipeline configuration app. This is a model-driven app which we can use to create our pipelines. So taking a look on our process, we're now finished with the first step, installing the Power Platform pipelines. So this is basically the app, and what we want to do in the first step is create our environments in this app. So our dev, test, and prod environment. We will start with a new environment. Call this dev. Environment type is a development environment, and the environment ID, we need this from our Power Platform Admin Center. So go on the dev environment and copy the environment ID. We can save and close, and we need to perform the same steps for our test and our prod environment. So the test environment is not a development environment anymore, it's a target environment. Also paste the environment ID, click save and close, and create the prod environment last but not least. Also target environment ID, hit save and close. So now our environments are created, and we can move a step forward with creating our pipeline. And I will call this dev test to prod and leave it as is, hit save. And now I can link a specific development environment. So I will click on add existing development environment, hit the dev environment, and the next step is to create a new deployment stage, because we want now to create a stage which is called deploy dev to test. And our previous deployment stage is, there is no previous stage because we start with our development environment, and the target deployment ID is our test environment. Maybe when you click in this here the first time, we need to hit enter so that the test environment, for example, gets visible. And now comes the tricky part, because this one here is very interesting for us, is delegated deployment. And now before we move on with the creation of the deployment stage, we need to create our service principal. We can choose this here, so that we can use this service principal to do the deployment for us with the specific security role and permissions on the environment. And therefore we need a service principal client ID, and now we will switch to Azure and create this service principal. So to create a service principal, we hit portal.azure.com and search for app registrations, create a new registration. We call this service principal Power Platform deployment, hit on register. And now it's important that you add yourself as an owner. So in my case, this is this account. And also, if you look for the service principal, you can see there's an application and there's a service principal. Hit on the service principal. Add yourself also as the owner of the service principal. So these two steps are really important. I missed them the first time and ran into this error. You can see it here. It's documented, and that's really important, because the error you get is that the deployment stage owner, the deployment stage we want to create, and then the next step is not the owner of the service principal. So you need to be the owner of the service principal, as well as, we take a look at this, as well as the application. So this is the application, and there's a second, I think it's called resource maybe, don't know. And this is the service principal and also the owner of this service principal. So taking back a look at our process, we have now managed to create the service principal. And in our third step, we will now add the service principal to our environments. And this step is really easy. We will just move to our environments. We will start with the dev environment and look for as to S users, so server to server, apps or users. Create new user, select your specific business unit, click off add an app. There you can see here's the service principal we've just created. So add this to the environment, and I will assign this service principal the system administrator role so that he can perform all the deployments for us. Perform the same task on the test environment. So add the service principal, add a business unit, and assign a security role, and for our prod environment as well. New app user, service principal, business unit, the security role. There we go. That's an easy one. So we also managed to do step number 3. And now we already started with creating the pipeline. So we opened the app, we've stored all our environments, and we also started with creating the pipeline. Now we can move on with creating the deployment stage. And therefore we will move back to our service principal, search for the service principal in our intro ID. There it is. And we will copy the application ID, move back to our pipeline. And this was the step where we kicked off to creating the service principal. Now we have a service principal client ID. We will paste this here and hit on save and close. So now we're done with our first deployment stage to move from dev to the test environment. And now we will create the next deployment stage to deploy from test to our prod environment. Also here we will click is delegated deployment. We will select the service principal, paste the client ID and hit save. Of course, we need to define a previous deployment stage because we previously deployed from dev to test, and a target deployment environment ID, which is our prod environment. So now again, save and close. This seemed to work. And now, taking a look back at our process, we are almost done. We've created the deployment stage, we entered the client ID, we created the specific deployment state for test to prod, and we saved the whole thing. So now the next step, we need to authorize the user for the deployment pipeline. So to share the pipeline with the makers, there are basically two steps we need to perform. First of all, we need to assign the maker with the deployment pipeline's user security role, and we need to share the record, the deployment pipeline configuration app. So we switch back into our environments and start on our dev environment by assigning the security role. Usually you would do this with using an intra ID security group. For the purpose of this demo, I will assign the security role directly. So we will look for deployment pipeline user role. And on our dev environment, Marie Hansen has also system customizer access to develop and modify their solution. On our test environment, Marie has only the basic user role, so she has basically only a read-only access to this environment. And the same is true for our prod environment. Marie has only the basic user role for the prod environment, so also read-only access. We can perform a test on this using our prod environment and try to create a flow, manually triggered flow, add an action and hit and save. And as you can see, you're not permitted to make flows in this prod. Please switch to the default environment or to one of your own environments where you have maker permissions. So she currently has not the permission to create in our prod environment. So taking a look at our process, we also done with this step. Now that we've assigned the correct security role, we also need to share the specific record. Therefore, we switch to the deployment pipeline app, click on the share records, and as you can see, I've already assigned Marie the read access for this deployment pipeline I've created. So this step is also very important. We're also done with that now, and now we can try to perform a deployment from a dev to a test to a prod environment. So we now switch to Marie's account, and we will start with creating our first solution. So Marie, she works at EinfachMachen as a rental company for mopeds and bikes. So we need an app to manage our rentals. So we tell Copilot to create us an app or a table to manage our moped and bike rentals with some sample data. This looks good. So let's create the app. There we go. Pretty simple app. We just hit save and go back. Now we put all this stuff into our solution. Click on create. Add the existing Canvas app. There it is. And also we want to add the table. Therefore click on advanced, add required objects and add the table. And last but not least, we will add a security role, which is only made for this solution. So it's based on the basic user, but for the specific table we've just created, we've assigned some higher privileges on the user for create, read, write, delete, append to, assign and share. So Marie also wants to add this security role to her solution. Hit on security role. There is the basic user plus full access on the moped and bike rentals table. Hit on add, and now our solution is complete, and we can move on to deploy this stuff to our prod environment. So before starting the deployment, let's have a final look on the security roles. We're now in our dev environment, and you can see we are a maker with data access, with this basically the system customizer. Let's switch to the test environment. Here we have the run only users role, so the basic user role, and let's switch to the prod environment. Here you can see we have the same role, we have the run only user role, so we are not able to create any stuff in the test or in the prod environment, just in the dev environment. Now let's start the deployment. We're in our solution and you can see we're currently on the dev environment, and we switch to the pipeline functionality. Here we can see the pipeline that was just shared with Marie's account, with Marie here, and now we hit on deploy. Click on next, and now we can hit deploy. And you can see the deployment is starting, currently exporting artifacts. Okay, shortly after starting the deployment, there is this message: your request to deploy is pending. And this is where I've got caught up in some confusion, honestly, because I did not read the documentation comprehensively. If we take a look at this part where we define the deployment stage, there is an information: by checking this box, you must also configure an external process in the environment to approve or reject the delegated deployment. So the final step we have to take as the administrator is define some kind of process to approve this deployment. And yeah, because I think this might be something that you should do after creating the pipeline, I think it might be a good idea to document this step also in the video. So there is a sample solution at the Microsoft documentation which we can use, and we will start off with installing this solution. So we switch into our admin account and import this solution. You can download it right here. So the next step, we click on next, and now we have some connections that are needed. We click also on next. And here we can enter the email which receives the approvals after some maker starts a deployment process on the dev or the test environment. So I will enter my email address for this because I want to receive these emails and approve them. And now I can hit import and this solution gets imported. It's quite a lightweight solution. There are 2 flows in it. And so we are done with the first 2 steps, downloading and installing and setting the approver's email. So the third thing I would personally recommend to you is setting an environment variable for your dev to test stage. I will show you in a minute why I think this is a good idea. If we go into the Cloudflow, so this one, click on edit, we can see that the name for the deployment stage name is set statically with UAT. In my case, I gave it another name. If we switch into the pipeline solution and go right into the pipeline, go to our deployment stages, I called this dev to test stage, deploy dev to test. So I would have to set the name like this. And I don't want to be this in a static way, so I switch to the solution, open the sample pipelines delegated deployment flows, and create a new environment variable for this value. So I call it delegated deployment dev to test stage name, give it a short description, choose text here, and add the value. In my case, it's deploy dev to test. Hit save. And now I can edit this flow and use this value instead. So this is the stage name now. The second thing I've encountered is that there's some static email address from Ryan J, who maybe built this solution, and this leads to oftentimes failing this approval because this person is obviously not in my tenant and obviously also not in your tenant, I think. And the first about 10 times I've tried this flow, it got me failing because it tells me that this user is not within my organization. So keep this also in mind. So taking a look at our process, we're done with the fixing stuff. And the last thing that we need to do is that we need to connect to Dataverse using the service principal, not the user. This is the second error I've encountered, and you can see this here. So I tried to deploy, and you can see I've got this error. Delegated deployment of type service principal may only be approved or rejected by the service principal. In my case, I already created this connection, but I will delete this connection and walk you through the creation of such a service principal connection for Dataverse. So we go into the flow, click on edit and add a new connection reference, and here we choose connect to service principal. I will call it the same as the service principal. There it is, into this name. And then I need the client ID, which is this one. And I also need a client secret. You can create a client secret here. I will create a new client secret, copy the client secret, And the final step is to get the tenant ID. I did this on the Enter ID side. There might be multiple ways to do this. Enter the tenant ID, click on Create, and now the service principal is connected and you're using the service principal instead of your personal connection in the context of Dataverse. So now we're done with this flow, and hopefully our deployment should work fine now. So the deployment to the test stage should be auto-approved because we've defined this in this condition, and the deployment to our prod environment should not be auto-approved, but we should receive an email to approve the deployment to our prod environment. So we switch back to the account of Marie and cancel this deployment and start a new one. So deploy here, next one, hit deploy, and now we're deploying to our test environment, and our flow should get triggered in some seconds. And there we can see the request is pending, and there's a failure. There's an error in our flow, so this might be due to the fact that we did not change the connections in other steps. Yes, so we need this connection, of course, and have a look in the other actions as well. Of course, we need this connection and this connection. So it's a bit hacky, this step, I think. So it's saved. Let's put it on test and start another deployment process. And now we can see that this flow run was successfully, and we can see that it's deploying now. So we are currently deploying from our dev to test environment, and this one should be auto approved, or there should be no approval be needed. So now our solution is successfully deployed, and we can take a look on our test environment, and we can see here's a new solution, and we can also see that this solution got deployed by our service principal. So not the user, not Marie, but the service principal. And now we will move on to the final stage. So deploy to our prod environment. We click on deploy here, click on next, and hit the deploy button to deploy to our prod environment. And now you can see that directly by hitting the deploy button, the flow gets triggered again. And now I have to give my approval as the administrator of the environment. So I've just received an email with the approval, and hit on approve, click on submit. Now we can see that the approval gets approved. Refresh this one, and now we can see that the deployment is running to our production environment using the service principal again. And there we go, we've just deployed to production. Let's have a look on our production environment. And here we can see the bike and moped rentals solution as a managed solution on our prod environment, which got deployed by the service principal. So without Marie having any write access to this environment. So to conclude, this process of configuring the approval was a bit surprising to me, and this may be something that you would do when configuring and creating the pipelines and adding the service principal and all this stuff. But nevertheless, we've managed to get this running, and now we can enable citizen developer teams to deploy to test or production environments without giving them high permissions on these target environments. Some concluding thoughts on this. I think even though we managed to do this, it's still a bit hacky. So there's this thing with the sample solution where we've got an email value, which is obviously not a member of my organization. I personally would have put an environment variable into this condition, so like we did in the video. And another thing, that this first solution, pipelines extensibility samples, did not work for me. I've always got an error in the cloud flows, so I've tried it with this solution. Another thing, I think there might be some scenarios where something is broke in production and the makers or the maker team want to look into their flow runs, not edit them, but just have a look into the flow runs to see what the error is. We could do this with any kind of exception handling, sending emails, but I think there are also some scenarios where we maybe want to have a look into the flow runs. And currently I couldn't find any security role that gives me this scenario of some kind of an enhanced reader who has reading access in the flow runs, but who cannot edit the flow directly in the prod environment. And another thing I couldn't manage to achieve is assigning a security group to with the pipeline access. So when I want to share the record of the pipeline I've created here, so our dev test to prod environment, I didn't manage to assign it to a security role, to a security group that I've created where all my makers are in. So I had to assign this record directly to my maker, and I think it might be a bit better if we could assign this to a whole security group. So that's it from my side. I think even though it is a bit hacky, it's still a great improvement using these delegated deployments with Service Principal. I'm looking forward to your feedback and see you next time.